Hello everyone, my name is Paulus, and today I want to tell you a story of how I had to go slow to go fast. So I work for a company called Pitch, and we build a presentation tool. And the story goes like this. You probably know the feeling, you're building something, you're really proud of it, it works really well, and then at some point the QA person comes and kind of taps you on the shoulder, right? And that's pretty much what happened to us at Pitch. We were building the data layer, the foundation of the app, and everything was working fine up to the point where you would open the same document in 2 tabs of the same browser at the same time. And you would see exceptions and potentially even worse, data corruption. So of course we didn't want that. So we sat down and we racked our brains and we tried to find a way to fix this. Unfortunately, it turned out to be surprisingly difficult to fix the problem. So we listed out all the alternatives, but none of the alternatives actually seemed to involve trade-offs that we were willing to accept. So that was towards the end of last year, and now fast forward to 2020, to the beginning of the year, and we shipped a solution to the problem that we're happy with, and best of all, it only took us 2 weeks to implement the solution. So what happened? What changed in the meantime? So the difference wasn't that we came up with some brilliant code, although of course we had to write some code that had to be reliable to be able to fix the problem. But the problem, the solution wasn't so much in the writing of code, but in the writing of English prose. So what we did was to sit down and write down on paper all the alternatives that we could think of, including all the pros and cons. And what we did was we wrote all of this down as complete sentences, as complete thoughts, composed into complete paragraphs. And this really helped us to make the decision and to find the solution to the problem. And paradoxically, that means that we had to go slow first, right? Because although the actual fix, the actual implementation of the solution only took us 2 weeks of implementation time, before that we had to actually write down the document, and that took us longer than that. So I'm not saying that we spent months writing this document 8 hours a day. We wrote the document, then we put it on the side, we discussed it, we came back to it. We got some feedback and we introduced the feedback into the document. And bit by bit, we improved our understanding of the issues. So really, we had to go slow at the beginning in order to be able to go fast at the end. So even though this was a tricky problem, I don't have any regrets going through this experience. And that's because we learned a lot in the process. What this experience taught us was that writing English prose is a very powerful tool when you're making decisions. And especially that's true for technical decisions. So with only just a little bit of hyperbole, I want to claim this. The most powerful way of becoming a more effective programmer is to become a more effective writer. Now, if that sounds unlikely to you, that's maybe because if you look around yourself in the technical sphere, what you see is sloppy writing, what you see is careless writing, quite a lot. You see GitHub readmes that talk about basically everything except for the thing that you're actually looking for, the thing that you really need to know. And what you see is also documentation that is so incoherent to the point that it's not clear what it's really talking about. So you may be excused for coming to the conclusion that good writing is dead. And in fact, people have been complaining about writing for a long, long time. So this quote is from a book called Effective Writing by Henrietta Tichy from the 1960s. And it's a really good book. I really recommend it, although it's out of print, so it's a little bit hard to find. But it's 500 pages of very useful information about how to improve your writing, especially technical writing. And in this quote, Tichy says, "Who is to blame for the miserable writing in government documents, in business reports, in instructions of all kinds, in articles in learned journals, and in papers read at conventions?" And I guess in the time since these lines were written, things haven't really improved all that much. So let's take business reports first. It used to be the case that in businesses, in the workplace, people would write memos. So people would actually type out reports and memos on their typewriters, and then those would be photocopied and then distributed in the entire company. But of course, technological change happened, and memos were replaced by emails, and emails were replaced by Slack messages. And in the 60s, there was a day worth of work to compose a memo and then distribute it in the company. And today it takes you all of 5 seconds to send a message to @channel and reach the entire company. And then the second thing is, if you look at this quote, she talks about papers read at conventions. And that's basically what I'm doing here, right? It's a technical conference. And when she says papers are read, she meant that literally. It used to be the case that you would actually write out your whole speech and then read it out loud to the audience. And when I started out in university, it was still a pretty common way to do conference talks. And in fact, if you look around you, you see TED Talks and technical conferences springing up from the ground like wild mushrooms. So it feels like communication is becoming more and more informal on both of those sides. The writing in the workplace as well as communication in general. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all. I'm part of this cultural trend, and I'm a child of my age, and I really like Slack as a communication medium. And I like Rich Hickey's lectures, and those were powerful in part because they were delivered as spoken word recorded videos to the world. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing in the least, but I do think that along the way we've kind of forgotten something. We've kind of lost something on the way. And that's that we've forgotten about the value of good writing in the workplace. So this is an example of a memo like it used to be written. All right, so the value of good writing is not always appreciated, but there's a place in tech where writing is held in very high regard, and that's Amazon. So to give you one example, if you're applying to Amazon as a manager, you have to submit a writing sample, and that's going to be evaluated as part of your job application. And to make it even more obvious how important this is, well, let me skip over that for a second. To make it more obvious how important writing is for Amazon is to look at this quote. And this is from Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. And it's from his letter to the shareholders, an annual letter that is delivered every year. And Bezos takes the opportunity to talk about things that he cares about in this memo, in this letter. And he says the following. He talks about the practice of using memos as a decision-making tool at Amazon. And he credits those memos as an important part of why Amazon is so successful. And he says about those memos, not surprisingly, the quality of these memos varies widely. Some have the clarity of angels singing. They are brilliant and thoughtful and set up the meeting for high-quality discussion. Sometimes they come in at the other end of the spectrum. Right, so that's how much Jeff Bezos cares about writing. In a financial document delivered to all of the shareholders of the company, he likens good corporate writing to angels singing. I thought that was brilliant. So what role does writing play at Amazon? You can kind of get a glimpse of that because Amazon managers have talked about that publicly. And here's another quote about this practice of writing 6-page memos at Amazon. And the quote goes like this: "The process of writing 6-page memos forces you to think things through. You can't gloss over problems or hide behind complexity. You actually have to work things out. All of this happens before the first meeting." So that's the idea, right? Instead of calling a meeting and then jumping into a discussion right away, people are required, when they invite people for a meeting, to submit a 6-page memo, a document that describes the proposal and discusses the pros and cons at length. And the idea is that this happens before the meeting starts. The idea being that you really help improve the quality of the discussion. Now, I know what you're thinking about this, right? If I was an Amazon employee and I wrote this 6-page memo and I put a couple of weeks into like making it really perfect, and then I send it around to everyone, then no one's going to read it because busy managers don't have time, and really like sitting down and reading a document is not something that people do in today's high-tech companies. And Amazon really acknowledges this problem and attacks it head-on by doing two things. First thing is that at Amazon these memos are short, so they're only 6 pages long. So it's some amount of work to read it, but it's doable. And then the second more important thing is you don't actually have to read the memo before you arrive at the meeting. Instead, what happens is you come to the meeting, and you find in front of you on the table a printed copy of the document, and you have a red pen in your hand, and then everybody sits down and reads the document for 10 to 15 minutes. And then when the 15 minutes are over, the discussion starts, and everybody is informed and has a good basis for the discussion. So what are the advantages of the written form? So again, this is Bezos in an earlier communication from 2004. This is an email that was shared, and it's become pretty famous. And in this email, Bezos says the following: "Well-structured narrative text is what we're after, rather than just text. The reason writing a 4-page memo is harder than writing a 20-page PowerPoint is because the narrative structure of a good memo forces better thought and better understanding of what's more important than what and how things are related." And those are two really important elements. So the first one is this idea of relative importance. If you're presenting a couple of ideas, then it's important to convey to the audience which of those ideas are the most important ones. And that allows you to zoom in on the essentials and disregard the distractions. And the second point he's making here is that writing really emphasizes the connectedness of ideas. If you're presenting an idea, that idea and this abstraction, this feature, this product will have many relations to other products or abstractions or features. And you really want to emphasize those relations. Because if you do, that helps you improve the quality of the discussion. And I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons why some companies are more successful than others is that the quality of their meetings are better. So Bezos is also famous for banning PowerPoint from Amazon. So I guess the question could be raised, are presentations useless? And the answer is no. And it's not going to be a surprise to you that I'm saying this, because I'm standing in front of you at a tech conference and holding a presentation. And I think there's a reason for this. If you look at this quote again, Bezos is really after this narrative structure, right? The storytelling aspect. And if you think about it, storytelling in the most pure sense existed long before we had writing, when we were like as a species sitting around the campfire and kind of telling each other stories. So the spoken word has a claim to storytelling as much as writing does. So really, I think it's a question of sweet spots. I think different mediums have different sweet spots. It really depends on what you're after. So if it's that you're trying to inspire an audience, if you're trying to instruct them in some way, because of the liveliness of a spoken word presentations, the presentation might be preferable. But on the other hand, if you're after verifiability, if you want to check and recheck your results and have other people check your results, or if you're trying to produce something that at a later point you will be able to come back to as a reference point, then a written document will be better. Okay, so I think it's pretty clear that if you're trying to make a technical decision, those criteria are a given. You know, you want to produce something that is verifiable. So I'm going to talk about how we at Pitch do that. And we call the documents that we produce, like the one that I talked about at the beginning of this talk in the little story. We call those documents request for comments, or RFCs. And we find that these RFC documents really help us make good technical decisions. And we have a certain structure for those RFCs. We have like section headers that we suggest to authors. But I'm not going to talk about those very much because although I think that they're good for Pitch, they might not be good for your organization. What works for us may not be the right thing for you. And also, what really matters is not the specific points, the specific structure of the document. It's that you take the time to sit down and collect your thoughts and write things down on paper. Having said that, here are a couple of characteristics of RFCs at Pitch. And the first one is that we talk about data structures quite a lot. And this is encapsulated in this quote, which you probably know, but it's so good that you can't repeat this often enough. So this is from the Mythical Man Month, and it goes, "Show me your flowcharts and conceal your tables, and I shall continue to be mystified. Show me your tables, and I won't usually need your flowcharts. They'll be obvious." So in this quote, Brooks is talking about tables, and when he talks about tables, he means something like data structures. So that might include actual database SQL tables, but it might also include in-memory data structures like closure maps and vectors and so on. And if you're going to propose a new abstraction, a new feature, then it's very useful to include something like a rough idea of how those data structures in your code base are going to change. And that's because, as the quote implies, there's really no better way to convey intentions than to talk about the data structures, because those structures are really at the heart of your program. The second characteristic is that if you're writing an RFC, you want to try to locate your proposal in the space of possibilities. And by that I mean something very similar to what Bezos talked about in the quote earlier, when he talked about this interconnectedness of ideas, how things are related. And that means, more concretely, when you're writing an RFC, you want to be discussing different alternative routes to the same goal. And you want to be describing the pros and cons and the reasons why you rejected the other alternatives and the reasons why you went with the proposal that was picked in this RFC. So include alternatives considered in your RFC. Okay, so what are the benefits of RFCs? I mean, I've kind of already talked about those a little bit, but I want to make it a little bit more concrete. So let's start with the first benefit, and that it really helps with cross-team communication. It's a pretty efficient way to convey your intent to other people in the company, because you're taking the time to write down concisely what your proposal is going to be. And if you're doing that, other teams may be able to chime in and make some suggestions, and you can try to avoid the problem that you're building an abstraction that is really at odds with what another team is building. Maybe another team is already building something similar, or maybe you're building something that doesn't really work for the next use case that this other team will need. Second benefit is that an RFC helps you to fix problems early in the process, in the development process. And to illustrate that, I want to put up another quote. And this is from Andy Grove, the longtime CEO of Intel, and his book, High Output Management, is one of the classics of Silicon Valley literature. And in this quote he says, "A common rule we should always try to heed is to detect and fix any problems at the lowest value stage possible." So coming from Intel, Grove thinks about a development process almost like an assembly line, right? You start with some kind of material, and then the material passes through different work steps. And it starts, the material is still at the lowest value stage, and then at each point, the work step adds some value to the product until finally it lands in the hands of the customer. And that's going to be the highest value stage. And crucially, at each of those steps, you can introduce an inspection step. So you can check if your work is up to your standards, for example, at the beginning when you're checking the material that goes into the process. And you can say something similar about software development. Software development can be seen as an idea, some kind of idea for a feature that gets developed more and more as it passes through this process. You start with this ideation phase. Then it's spec'd out. There's an implementation phase. There's a QA phase and testing phase, and at the end, maybe some kind of bug fixing phase, and finally, the customer gets to see it. And similar to the assembly line, you can introduce inspection steps at each of those steps. And Grove's point here really also applies, because if you can introduce a review step early on in the process where you check your plan when the stage is still concerned with something that is low value, then it's much cheaper to fix problems than if you wait until the end of the process. Okay, the final benefit I want to talk about is this. And it's such an important benefit that if all the other benefits didn't apply, then this benefit would still make it the case that it would be worth it to write those RFCs. And again, there's a quote that really captures this. And it goes, "Writing is nature's way of letting you know how sloppy your thinking is." And really, as far as quotes go, that's one of my favorites because it really captures my experience. I don't really understand, I don't really think things through until I take the time to write things down on paper. So, by writing things down, you can improve the clarity of your proposal, you can improve the clarity of your decisions, and that's going to be a big factor in the success of your product. So just to summarize this, you can think of the different intended audience of an RFC document. Of course, there are reviewers who are involved pretty early on that will take a look at your proposal, maybe from other teams. Then there's future colleagues. You might want to go back to earlier RFCs to be able to understand why things turned out the way they did turn out. And then finally, most importantly, it's the author themselves who can be seen as an audience of an RFC. So, if all of those things are true, why don't people write? Why don't we write? Why don't we take the time? And I want to close out with 2 reasons. The first reason is psychological. Because if you're writing an RFC, if you're writing a document and making things explicit, making your thought processes explicit, you're kind of putting yourself out there. You're opening yourself up for criticism. And that can be hard psychologically. But it's also kind of the point, right? We want to achieve this clarity that only comes from the criticism that you get for your writing. So the way to remove this obstacle, in my mind, is to encourage a culture of empathy where when somebody is writing, a document, it's understood that people who will be reading this document will also appreciate the time and effort that the author put into the writing process. And you really want to avoid the problem of bike shedding as well. And then finally, the reason why people don't write is that writing is hard, right? It takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of practice. And the first draft that you're going to write is probably going to be pretty bad. Writing is rewriting. So all of this takes time, all of this practice takes time. And I think we as programmers and as technical people need to make room for letting people get better at writing and getting better at practicing and writing and rewriting those documents. And I think if we do that, then ideally we will be able to hear the angels sing. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Paulus. That was really good inspiration to get us all into writing more. Are there any questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks. It's absolutely wonderful and totally on his side. I have one suggestion I'd like to share with the rest of you, and two questions. The one thing is, everybody speaking German should read Deutsch für Profis from Wolfgang Schneider. He's a journalist, and it's a really, really short book on how to improve your style of writing. Like what, like for example, to write in an active style, not in a passive style, which is basically interesting because it improves not only the style of your writing, but the components you write in code afterwards, which is emphasizing your point. So Deutsch für Profis, for everybody understanding German. And the question for you is, you told us how Amazon puts emphasis reading habits by having that 10 to 15 minute intro phase at the meetings. How did you do that at Pitch? This is one question. And the second question is, I'm a fan of living documents, meaning you change your mind over time. When you move on and have the next feature, you go back to the document and alter it. What's your experience with that?
Okay, so for the first question, the question was how do we do this study hall 50 minutes time at the beginning of each meeting at Pitch? And the answer is we don't do it. Part of the reason is that we are a company that is partly remote, and part of the charm of this Amazon ritual is that people are sitting in the same room and sitting there silently and reading a document. So it's also an open question for me how this practice could translate to a remote company. And what was the second question again? Concerns the living documents. Oh yeah. Translated into the future. Right, so living documents. So we write these RFCs as markdown files that could get committed to our repository, and we don't update them after the fact. So they are more like a historical record of the decision-making process than something that necessarily is exactly up to date with how we ended up implementing the feature. So the RFC process doesn't completely replace the need for putting up up-to-date documentation. I think that's kind of a separate concern. But it can still be very useful when you're trying to understand why things are the way they are, to be able to go back kind of from an archaeological point of view and to understand how that decision got made in the first place.
Okay, thank you. I think we had one more question over here, maybe two.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm working in a team where we have a strong culture for getting things done, and that often means committing some code to master. Do you have any recommendations for bringing this approach and coping with pressure and stress and the need for speed?
Yeah, I would argue that it's not at odds with getting things done as quickly as possible, because the time that you invest at the beginning of the process, you will be able to get back or even get back more of that at the end of the process, because you'll end up with fewer bugs, you'll end up with building features or abstractions that are more aligned with your business. So I would say that in general, the agile methodology is completely cool with taking the time to make a plan. It's true that Agile says that one of the points in the Agile manifesto is that we should value reacting to changes more than sticking to a plan, and that's something I totally agree with. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be making a plan. You can make a plan, and then if there are any changes in the environment, or you realize that it doesn't work exactly how you thought it would work during the implementation phase, it's totally fine to change the plan. But the value of actually making the plan and thinking things through before you start implementation is still there.
Great, thank you. We have 2 more questions.
My question is basically how do you, because I mean there's some overhead of this obviously compared to just making a decision, but how do you decide or define when is the question big enough for an RFC compared to, I don't know, just make a decision team or something else?
Yeah, I would say that it's up to the author of the feature or the team making the decision to make the judgment if it's worth writing a document for. There's obviously some things that are too small to make the effort, and there are some things that clearly warrant an RFC. So there's always going to be some kind of question of experience to tell if it's one or the other. As a rule of thumb, I think something that you can say is if you're making a significant change to the architecture, if you're changing the interface, the external interface or the internal interface of your code base, then it's a good idea to put up an RFC.
Great, and then one last question.
So regarding writing memos before the meeting, when you do that, you already put a certain opinion in there, and it's hard to run a session that is completely open-minded from my point of view. Do you have any advice on how to keep this balance between writing a good memo and keeping the session, like a brainstorming, more open-minded? Thank you.
Well, I think you're making a really good point, and there's a danger that you're kind of trying to impose your own opinion by structuring the discussion using the document. And I think it's a good idea to be up to the point where that's possible, to be unbiased when you're writing the document. So include alternatives that you really dislike, but still write them down so that people can pick you up, pick those alternatives up and ask you, why are we not doing this? This is so much simpler. Why do we have to do this big thing that you're suggesting? So I think it's good to be unopinionated when you're trying to describe the alternatives, but at the same time, I don't think it's 100% possible to take your own opinion out of it, and I think that's totally fair. It's up to the discussion. It should be fine in the discussion to bring up some fundamental criticism of your approach as well, and then you can kind of send the memo back to the drawing board, update it, make some improvements, and then do another meeting a month later.
Great. Thank you for all the inspiration, and give another hand for Paulus.